Anyway, they're there for the blessing of whoever. And are we ready to roll? Okay. Oh, and David and Morgan, they're in Arco. That's why they're not here. And so they're all excited to go and see their place there and spend some time, which is a blessing. Anything else you have recommended for filler? Yes, Obadiah is sick, and I think it's extended to the family as well, or just it was to, anyway, we know Obadiah was sick. That's why he wasn't here leading, and probably it's affected the rest of the family or some of them. So they are home. We could have prayed for these people, I guess. But you can write it down in your prayer journal for the week. I had identified particulars. Okay. And there is a thankfulness that Josiah and Jess are back from their trip. How are we doing back there? Have you clicked on YouTube? Oh, well, hopefully Obadiah is checking it out and he can text in or somebody and let us know. We'll go ahead and go forward here. Thankfully, the Holy Spirit waits on technology too. Okay, well, if you would please stand, we'll take a more formal approach now. We're going to read God's Word. We are in Romans 1, and we're in the last section of Romans 1, and probably the last message that covers directly chapter 1. I'm going to be starting at verse 26 and go through verse 32. So Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 32, this is the word of the Lord. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lusts for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of all evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. May God bless our time of considering his word. You may be seated. Well, as I mentioned, we're completing chapter 1 of the book of Romans. And as you can gather from what we have read, we're about to cover what I suppose some might consider, I really think of it this way, as some of the darkest and most disgusting portions of the Word of God. The content is of a nature that is like that. It's of that nature because the subject demands that the level of dark and disgusting terminology be used. So, what topic is it that is such a repulsive topic, one of such a repulsive nature? In a word, the topic is mankind. Yeah, it's mankind. It's an honest look at the true nature of mankind that is going on here, and that brings out this language of very low vulgarity or low depictions that Paul uses here in the last part of this chapter. Paul, as we've seen, as we've walked through this opening chapter, has brought his reader to the place where they need to look at themselves and they need to see where mankind is. They need an honest assessment of mankind. He's presented the gospel. He did this back in verse 16, where he stated the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. He defines that as the gospel, and that this salvation is obtained through an imputation of the righteousness of God to the believer, and that this is solely obtained, if you want to use that word, by faith. It's solely obtained by faith. He made the statement, the just shall live by faith. And after creating this dramatic thesis statement that we've looked at probably each time we've started here in Romans, for it is the thesis of the whole book, he now enters into his argument as to why all mankind needs this salvation. Why does mankind need salvation? Well, quite simply, in the words of Paul, because the wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Mankind, in their natural state, he says, suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's what he tells us in, I think it's verse 18. All mankind knows the truth, or knows at least truth about God, because though you can't see God, they can't touch his attributes, these unseen things of God are clearly manifest, Paul tells us. They're clearly manifest in man, and they're clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Creation itself, then, Paul asserts, manifests the omnipotence of God as well as his divinity, that is, his godness, in that he sustains, he maintains, and he governs the whole world and all that is going on and cares for it. None of these truths that validate for all mankind that God exists and is worthy of worship can be missed by anybody. Paul says nobody is with excuse. They're all left without excuse because these things have been shown. They are without excuse. They know the truth of God, but, as he's mentioned, they suppress this truth. And that's an unrighteous act. So it's stated as suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. We use the example of the beach ball, right? Of how you have to keep working at keeping it under the surface to not be seen. And so in the game where they push it down under the surface, the person is in contact with the reality of the beach ball, is working consciously to keep it down underneath, and in all this still will shout out as part of the game in the pool, ball, there's no ball. Where's the ball? I don't see a ball, right? And that is a depiction of what goes on in the world. In that same fashion, every human being that is unsaved denies God. Every atheist, every agnostic, every humanist of any stripe that you could think of is doing that same act. They know God exists because he's manifested himself. He's shown it. They're left without excuse. It's clearly seen through his creation. They're constantly in touch with the reality of God, and night and day, the psalmist says, his glory is being declared. So they can't even say, well, it's dark now, so I can't see God. The stars declare his glory, right? And so the unbeliever is involved in the same game and ends up playing the fool of self-deception, or the self-deceived fool, if you want to put it that way. And he then says, God, there's no God. I see no God. God does not exist. And the whole time he's having to work to keep that truth hidden even from himself, right? This is general revelation that Paul's talking about. And by this general revelation from God, God has and does make himself known. Clearly, Paul says, clearly known. It's not like, oh, it's obscure to me. And so man's without an excuse, right? Now, another aspect of man's nature is that he is ever a religious being. He is ever a religious creature. He can't avoid an innate drive to worship something. He must worship something. And through his self-deception about the existence of God, he doesn't worship God, but that innate drive to worship is still there, and he must. And Paul says he goes from the incorruptible to the corruptible, and he begins to worship the creature, the created thing. He actually ends up, no matter what avenue he goes through, worshiping himself. He glorifies himself, even as he worships nature, because he thinks it's so much better for his being to be in full submission to the way of nature. So he's still the center of all things. In fact, he will die for nature in some cases. Think about the people who chain themselves to a tree, right? or lay down in front of the logging trucks, or do something like that. They'll die for what they worship. So he worships nature and the world. He exchanges the truth of God for a lie. He's self-deceived in this lie. And it is the same self-deceived lie that was asserted from the beginning in the garden to the first man and woman. You can be as God. Ultimately, no matter what the object is identified, the worship is of oneself. And there's been movements in which this has become very overt. Those of you that are, I don't know how old you have to be. Do people remember Shirley MacLaine and Out on a Limb? What? Just me? Do you remember this?
I remember that, but I don't know what you're going to say.
Oh, well, Shirley MacLaine and in Out on a Limb. I think that was the title of her book, and she also did a little video thing where she's not out on a limb, she's running on a beach, but it's called Out on a Limb. She is out on a limb, and it's a pretty rotten one. But anyway, she's out there, and she's got her hands up, and she's shouting. It was all part of the New Age movement of that time in the latter part of the 20th century. He's shouting, I am God, I am God. I am God, right? Well, yeah, as I mentioned, she is out on some limb, and it's probably a rotten one because it's coming down. That will be coming down because the wrath of God, who is blessed forever, and is the only being that's worthy of praise and worship, which we just sang about. So worthy of praise, worthy of honor, worthy of glory. I had it right here in my notes. We just sang of that. So very timely for God to do that. Yeah, anything that doesn't glorify him is coming down. Well, mankind continues to insist on deliberately, that's one thing you got to keep in mind, it's not just that they're ignorant or whatever, though what you got to realize is they purposely say there's no truth of God, but they come to the point where they believe their thing that they're purposely saying, and so they become self-deceived. All right, and so they begin to believe their own deception, but they continue to deliberately suppress the truth. And as they continue to do this, then God begins to allow the depravity of mankind to begin showing itself in greater and greater degrees. And we actually began to see this the last time we talked about Romans, which was probably 3 Sundays back. But there you would see in verse 24, for example, which is before the text we started, it says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness. God also gave them up to uncleanness. You might say that this is the beginning of Paul's presentation of the descent of man into the depths of his depravity. Or you might say it is Paul's beginning of showing a greater and greater unveiling of the releasing of the depths of the depravity of mankind. It's there. It's there already. Okay, it's not like you become more and more depraved. You are this depraved. And there's something God does, or quits doing, as we'll see, that it begins to show itself more and more. Well, Paul's going to develop this doctrine of the nature of man more completely as we go through Romans. He'll get more particular about the origin of this and its outworking as sin in our lives. But we need to realize that it is the nature of all who enter this world, that all mankind, due to the fall of Adam, are born with a corrupt nature. This corrupt nature doctrinally is called original sin. You hear somebody say they're talking about original sin, they're actually talking about the nature of mankind, his corrupt nature that is rooted in the original sin that happened in the case of Adam and Eve disobeying. But this is not simply a bent towards sin. It's not really just a nature to have a propensity to sin. That's just, kind of corrupt or something. No, this corrupt nature is so corrupt that it is given the distinction of being depraved. Okay? It is depraved. In fact, the depravity of man is so extensive that the doctrine that speaks of that is called total depravity. Total depravity. Now, by total depravity, it's not meant to say that man even is as depraved as he can be. Okay? It's not meaning that, but it's saying that every fiber of his being, every attribute of his nature is corrupted. The depravity is total in its extent as far as touching every part of man's being. It's total in that way, not in its depth. So total depravity means that the depravity of man touches every aspect of who man is. Now, before you wipe your brow and say, I'm not as bad as I could be. Okay. Don't sigh relief quite yet, because though mankind is not as deeply corrupt as he can be, Paul's going to tell you that this corruption does run deep. Okay? It does run deep. Man is depraved totally. The extent of the corruption is total in that sense. The depth of the corruption of man is not, but it is not minor. The depth is not shallow. It is very, very deep. And Paul is demonstrating that in this text. Now, one of the reasons we might think of the depth of man's corruption as not being as deep as it is, we look out there and we see people that aren't believers that do decent things. Okay? man isn't that bad. Well, one of the reasons we don't think of it as being as deep as it is because God, in his mercy and grace, doesn't allow man's depravity to manifest itself in its depths that it exists. God, through a means that, I don't know if he's the first one to assert this, but he's often brought up when this topic comes up, Abraham Kuyper. It's a means of what Abraham Kuyper would call common grace. By that means, God restrains man's sinful acts for the good and preservation of mankind. If his common grace did not act, man would totally destroy himself and all mankind. Okay? Now, some in the Reformed faith, which we assert here, don't like that terminology. They shy away from the use of common grace, just to let you know. And it's because they want to reserve the term grace only for what God would bestow upon his elect. So they say, the unelect don't get grace. And so they do still talk about this restraining of mankind. They call it God's providence. Okay, they like to keep it under God's providence. So just let you know, you might come across where you're talking common grace and the person's saying, no, it's providence. Okay. But I think we can easily maintain a distinction here between, because I define providence a little differently. Providence is God's care of the world, providing in a timely fashion. Look at Providence in Webster's 1828. Providing in a timely fashion, that's which is needed. But anyway, we can make the distinction that God grants to mankind, between what God grants to mankind in general, and call that common grace. We don't deserve this. It's still an unmerited thing that God does. And what he grants to the elect in particular, that being his special and his saving grace. And I think common grace is really more appropriate to talk about when we're talking about what it is going on here in our text concerning the act of God in relation to man and the restraint that is upon man's expression of his depraved nature. So Paul is demonstrating here, again, the need for man to come to God in faith in order to be the recipient of the power of God to salvation. But to truly receive this good news, Paul knows that man needs to hear bad news. Okay? I mean, how many of us would grab the life preserver if we didn't think we were drowning? It's like, well, what's that out there for? Okay? Who would want life if he doesn't think he's dead? Why would you pursue it? Who would want rescue from eternal judgment if you didn't think you were under that very wrath of God? Why would you simply believe and be saved unless you knew that there was no good thing in you and every effort of your own to assert your own will simply drives you deeper and deeper into the depths of depravity, destruction, and judgment? You just make yourself more guilty. But unless you know that, why would you care about being saved from it? Well, there's Paul's mission. That's the mission he's going into and he's been driving into for the last few times we've talked about Romans. And here now he is going to go into its very depths and show us man's depravity. And we, along with Paul, are going to enter into that depths of discussion of what is the total depravity of man. So he begins with verse 26, and he says, for this reason. Now, when you hear those words, then you can think, well, this is why. This is why whatever I'm about to say is taking place. Why something is about to be said or will happen. Well, what is the basis? You got to look back a little bit. It's everything he's talked about up to that point, obviously, in the introduction. And especially the content of the last time we talked and the verses that just follow this, and much we have already reviewed. Because man purposely suppresses the truth, chooses to believe a lie, raises himself to the level of worship or worship in the created order, it is for this reason God takes an action. More precisely, God stops taking an action. Okay? Because what does the wording say in verse 26? For this reason, God gave them up. Now, when you give something up, you are releasing some level of possession. You are letting go of some level of claim upon something or someone else. So this is indicating that there's some status or relationship change, that there was one that existed that now is going into a changed state. And by the wording that follows, we can deduce that it is a restraint change, a change in the amount of restraint that God has given. God chooses to remove a restraint level of his common grace upon mankind, upon people who continue to pursue a suppressing of the truth. So again, God removes a level of his common grace or restraint on men's sinful expression. And really, what we see here in the latter part of Romans 1 is a step-by-step process of God removing a little more, and a little more, and a little more of that restraint, and man's depravity becoming a little more, and a little more, and a little more expressed. See, what I want you to notice is where we're starting here in verse 26, I've already kind of mentioned it. This isn't the first time it says that God gave them up. This is actually the second time that Paul has said that God gives man up to something. In fact, we referenced it, I think, a little bit earlier in verse 24. And from verse 24 through verse 28, it's stated 3 times. 3 times it's stated that God gives mankind up to something. And I think when we look at this more closely, we're going to see it's a progressive descent into deeper and deeper expressions of man's depravity. So let's actually back up to verse 24 for a moment and just kind of run through these 3 levels. In verse 24, it says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves. So that's the first pulling back of that basic restraint of mankind's lust. It's a sexual immorality that begins to increase here. We've definitely seen that in America in the last number of decades, in fact, here in America. And then we go to verse 26 and we see a similar expression of a giving up. In verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. So notice in verse 24, it's mankind is given up to uncleanness that is expressed through the lusts. The Greek words here are didn't put down the pronunciation, katharsia. And it is uncleanness, in particular, physical or moral impurity. So their morals becoming corrupted and degraded, and the natural physical activities, the epithumia or lusts that follow from this are then acted upon. Then you go to verse 26, and you clearly can see a step deeper into the abyss of man's depraved nature. And it's seen even in the English translation where it says vile passion, right? God gave them up to vile passions. At least that's the New King James wording here. But what it says here is that God gave them up to atomia pathos. And again, that's vile or disgraceful affections or lusts. Pathos being another Greek word that deals with your affections and your feelings, but is often translated lust. But here, these are not natural. These are not natural lusts, but they are vile and disgraceful lusts. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later. But to kind of complete our train of thought here on the giving up of mankind into deeper and deeper depravity, let's continue on as we progress from what we might call natural lusts to vile lusts. And now in verse 28, the third time that this is brought up, it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. God gives them over to a debased mind. The word debased there from the Greek adokimos. I think the King James does a helpful thing by calling it a reprobate mind. A reprobate. No, Webster tells us that adjective reprobate means abandoned to sin, abandoned to err. Their mind is given over to being completely governed by sin and error. That's reaching the lowest levels of depravity. From being given over to lusts that naturally challenge all men and women, to lusts that are of a vile and degrading nature, to finally a debasing of the mind, a reprobate mind that is under full control of sin and error. That's the descent of mankind, not anything being added to his nature, but the descent he goes to when God says, no longer do I restrain you, no longer do I restrain you, as he continues mankind to suppress truth and unrighteousness and chooses to believe a lie. Look